All right, so in this video, we're going to be using Webpack to compile our server code. So this might, even if you've used Webpack before, this might not be something you've done before. So we're going to go through it step by step and talk about how awesome it is. So as you see right here, we have an empty folder. This folder one day is going to contain our entire application, but for now it's just empty. And I have the empty folder in Explorer on the right, and I have a console window on the left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my npm init, and I'm just going to leave everything as default. You guys can play around with the versions, with the author, keywords, name, and license if you want to. But for this, I'm just leaving it with their defaults. And I hit enter a bunch of times that I didn't intend to, but that's okay. Next up, I'm going to do code dot to open up my favorite lightweight text editor, Visual Studio Code. And actually, before we really get started, I am going to go ahead and set up ESLint. So if you didn't watch the previous video, I use ESLint for my for making sure that I'm not doing anything stupid with JavaScript. ESLint is a fantastic package that will allow you to basically what it does is it lints your code. If you're not familiar with what linting is going through and making sure that your code makes semantic sense. Now, obviously, the compiler itself is going to, or the transpiler in the runtime is going to make sure your syntax is okay. But a linter makes checks your semantics and makes sure that you're coding in best practices, things are indented properly, you're not using something that hasn't been defined. Basically gives us a lot of some of the features that you would get in a compiled language in JavaScript. So we're going to be using ESLint. I do have the ESLint Visual Studio Code plugin installed. If you want to install that, which I recommend you do, hit Control-Shift-P, type in ext install, hit enter, and then simply type in ESLint and make sure that you have that installed. However, we will be overriding some of ESLint's default behaviors. So to do that, I'm going to, first of all, make sure that I have ESLint installed globally, which I do through npm install -d -g ESLint. So make sure you install ESLint globally like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say ESLint --init. And I'm just going to go through this. So I'm going to say answer questions about your style. I'm going to press enter because that's the option that's selected. I will be using ES 2015 features, also known as ES6. I will be using ES6 or ES 2015 modules. I'll be running this on both the server and the browser. So I'm going to hit space to select both node and browser. Hit enter. Do I use CommaJS? Yes. Will I be using JSX? No. And for style of indentation, I always use tabs. I love tabs. And for quotes, I always use double quotes. And then for my line endings, I'm going to be using Windows. And I do require semicolons. Now, if you're using the ESLint Visual Studio Code extension, make sure you select JSON. And that will print out your ESLint rc.json file, which should look like this. Now, I'm going to be making a couple changes. I'm going to take off the quotes. The quotes rule kind of freaks out when you use template strings that don't have a template variable in it, and it really bugs me. So I'm going to take that rule out. I don't like that rule. Another rule I'm not going to be using is no console. So I'm going to add a rule called no console, and I'm going to no console, and I'm going to set it to 0, turning off the no console rule. The no console rule, like its name implies, says you can't use console.log, which is good when you're linting for production use for the browser, because you don't want to log out things in your production browser code. It's not so great when we're doing development. And then, let's see, what else do I want to do? I want to enable template strings. So above rules, I'm going to add ECMA features, and I'm going to say template strings is true. For some reason, that particular ECMA feature is set to false in this version of ESLint. I'm sure now that ES 2015 has been standardized, one day it will not be set to false. But make sure you set that to true, because it says we will be using template strings. And the last thing I want to do is underneath rules, the order actually doesn't matter, but I kind of like this order. I'm going to add globals, and I'm going to say uppercase exception : false. Globals makes it so ESLint recognizes that there are some things that you're going to be using that aren't yet defined or are never defined. And for some reason, exception, even though it's in both the browser and Node itself, the exception class, is not defined by ESLint by default. So we have to make sure it's defined so that it doesn't complain when we try to use it. The parameter here can be either true or false. True would say, okay, ESLint, this object exists already, but it can be redefined. False says, okay, ESLint, this object exists and we can use it, but you can't redefine it. So we'll throw an error if we try to redefine it. All right. So before we build our Webpack configuration, let's talk about our directory structure. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to create a new folder called src. Under source, I'm going to create a folder called client. I'm going to create a folder called server. And I'm going to create a folder called shared. So all of our client code will be bundled into client. All of our server code will be bundled from server. And then both of these two environments will have access to all of our shared code. And we're going to use Webpack to make that work for us. So this is our source directory. I'm going to create 2 JavaScript files so that we can verify as we're going along that our Webpack configuration is working. So in server, I'm going to create a new file called server.js. And in shared, I'm going to create a new file called test.js. So in server.js, I'm going to say, well, in test.js, I'm going to say export function bleh console log it worked. Now in server, I'm going to say import bleh in brackets, in curly braces, from shared/test, and then I'm simply going to invoke bleh. So what I've done here is with these 5 lines of code, I've gone ahead and I've tested all of the configuration options from Webpack that we're going to need to actually put together. I'm using ES2015 modules. I'm accessing shared/test, which right now has no the server.js file has no knowledge of. We're going to use Webpack to alias out that folder, and then I'm invoking it. So this will allow us to make sure everything is working. Now there's going to be another folder. And the other folder is going to be next to source, and it's going to be called build. And this is where our built compiled server is going to go into. So basically, if you're not so much familiar with Webpack, it is a module loader, module bundler. I did have a series about this using modern JavaScript today that talked about Webpack features, if you want to go check that out. But the short of it is, what's going to happen here is Webpack's going to take this file, it's going to parse all the syntax that Node has no idea about, and it's going to turn our server.js file, no matter how many files it requires, into a single file that's going to be executable from Node. So let's go ahead and get started. To work with Webpack, we obviously need to, well, install Webpack. We also need to install a couple other things. We're going to be using the Babel transpiler. Now, Babel is a transpiler. It takes JavaScript written for a version that isn't yet supported by Node or browsers, and it converts it into JavaScript that can be used in Node and browsers. So we're using all standard features. All the JavaScript features that we're going to be using in this series is all 100% standardized. It was standardized last year in 2015. And we're going to use Babel to make sure that we can use these new standard features. So we're going to need a couple things. I'm going to say npm install. And I'm going to say --save-dev, because we only need these packages for during development. I'm going to install Webpack. I'm also going to install ESLint-loader, as well as ESLint, as well as Babel, or sorry, how about Babel-loader? And that should be all we need for right now. So I'll hit enter. While this installs, let me talk about what we installed. So we installed Webpack, which is going to be the tool that's going to make going to compile all of our files and watch our files and do incremental changes and do amazing things. If you've never worked with that Webpack before, you're going to love it. We're also grabbing ESLint loader and ESLint. Anything with -loader is generally a package that's used by Webpack to perform an operation. So not only am I using ESLint in my text editor to red squigglify everything that I did wrong, I'm also going to tell Webpack, hey, Webpack, when you compile this thing, when you compile whatever it is, the server or the client, run it through ESLint. And if ESLint produces an error, just stop. Consider an ESLint error to be to halt the execution of our transpilation step. So we cannot build without it going through ESLint, and I highly recommend you do that so that you don't do anything silly like reference a variable you haven't defined. I'm also grabbing ESLint as well, just the straight up package. I do believe ESLint is a peer dependency of ESLint loader, which is why I grabbed both. And then I grabbed Babel loader. Now Babel loader is going to be the Webpack loader that allows us to take our files and run it through Babel. And remember, what Babel's going to do is it's going to convert our ES2015 code into ES5 code. Now, I did forget a couple things, actually. I did forget my Babel core. Babel loader has a peer dependency on Babel core. Just like with ESLint loader, I had to also install ESLint. Babel loader, I also have to install Babel core. And then finally, Babel doesn't come with the modules it needs in order to convert ES 2015 code into ES5 code. It actually has to go in, and we have to install an additional package to do that. So sorry about that. I missed a couple of packages, but that happens. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here, where it'll probably warn us again about our unmet peer dependency. I guess not. And I'm going to say npm, oh, it does. It says Babel loader requires a peer of Babel core. So all this means is I have to also install Babel core. That's all. If you ever get this warning, make sure you follow its advice. So I'm going to say npm install -- save dev Babel core, but I'm also going to grab Babel preset ES 2015. And Babel preset ES 2015 is going to contain all the transformations we're going to use to convert our standards compliant ES 2015 code into ES5 code. And yes, it will take a few seconds to install. Anyway, with all of that done, before we get started, I am going to go ahead and close these out, and I'm going to open up my package.json. And I'm doing this for you future people, because you guys might be getting different versions of these packages. And I want to point out that if you run into an issue, make sure that your versions of the packages are similar to those that I have here. But again, the point I'm trying to make is, so far, to build our server code, we need these packages: Babel core, Babel loader, Babel preset ES 2015, ESLint, ESLoader, and finally, Webpack. So let's configure Webpack to build our server code. To do that, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a new file. And it's going to be called webpack.server.js. The name is arbitrary because we're going to have multiple Webpack configuration files. So I'll have a server and I'll have a client. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by doing something a little funky here. I'm going to say function create config is debug. And it's going to, for now, it's going to return an empty object. And then I'm going to say module.exports equals create config true. And then I'm going to say module.exports.create equals create config. So what I'm doing here is I have this function that's going to return our Webpack configuration. So I'll just say right here, Webpack config. This is where our Webpack configuration is going to go inside of this object. But I'm exporting this as a function. And the reason, both as a function and as a module exports, the reason is when we use Webpack, it'll expect an object that's filled with all the configuration values that it needs to work. And so by doing this, by exporting out an instance of our configuration, I can do something like node modules /bin or .bin /webpack -- config server, or whoops, /webpack.server. And it's going to error out because I don't actually have any configuration. But I want to be able to run Webpack from the command line. I also, however, want to create new copies of the configuration whenever I need them when we write our gulp file. So as a result, I'm exporting both the config object and the function that made the config object. I kind of came up with this pattern as sort of the best of both worlds without having to do any sort of object copying, which might not work with configuration files because we do pass in instance of objects into these config files. So I found this to be the easiest way to go about this. So let's go ahead and do our configuration. I'm actually going to, just to get rid of any confusion there, I'm going to take that out of the object. So this object is going to be what Webpack wants. First of all, we're going to specify the target node. That's going to set some presets in Webpack to make what Webpack outputs work better with Node than it would a browser. The default is a browser, by the way. Then I'm going to say dev tool is source-map. So that will generate source maps for our server, so that when we have an error somewhere, we'll see the line number that the error actually happened on from the code that we wrote in our source folder. Because remember, our server is going to be dumped out into this build folder. All right, then I'm going to say entry. And I'm simply going to say, entry is a funny one. Entry takes in a million different types of things. It takes in an array, it takes in a string, it can take in an object. It can do a lot. Check out the documentation if you want to. The configuration for Webpack is very, very kind of annoying. but once you get used to it, it's awesome. So I'm going to say entry is source server server.js. And this simply says, hey, Webpack, I want you to take this one file, compile it or transpile it, and then I want you to do all the processing on it, and then I want you to bundle it all together, and then I want you to output it somewhere. So that's the entry point right there, is our server.js. Then I'm going to say output, which is an object. The path is going to be, now for this, I'm going to need a package. At the top, I'm going to say var path equals require path. Remember, this Webpack server.js file is just a JavaScript file that runs on Node. So we can do crazy things like import other modules. So I want the path module, which comes built in with Node. I'm going to say path is path.join _ dir name build. Now that's because the output path property wants an absolute folder name. So it wants to, it needs an absolute path to where we want the output of Webpack to go. So that's why I have to path join on dir name and build. Dir name is a special thing from Node. Dir name is basically going to point to the current directory that we're in, which the absolute current directory that we're in, which is going to be wherever we executed Webpack from. Then I'm going to say file name is server.js, and that should be enough for that. Next up, we're going to do our modules. So I'm going to say resolve, and resolve is an object, and this gives us a lot of power and flexibility. Resolve, its responsibility is to instruct Webpack how to locate modules. And resolve is how we're going to map this shared folder into our server so that we can require code from shared from our server, but we can also require code from shared from our client. So I'm simply going to say resolve, and I'm going to open up the alias object. Alias is how we do that. And I'm going to say shared is going to be path.join dir name source shared. So shared, anytime it sees shared, like for example, right here, import ble from shared test. Anytime it sees shared as the first thing without a .. it's going to replace that with the absolute path of a file inside of the shared folder. All right, we're almost done. The last thing is module. So open up module, and then inside of module, open up loaders, and then open up an array. The loaders are how we transform our files. Right now, Webpack doesn't know anything about ES 2015. It doesn't know anything about ESLint. It doesn't know anything about anything. It just knows how to bundle CommonJS modules and do minification and make source maps, and that's it. We need to tell it about Babel and ESLint. So we do that. Let's tell about Babel first. I'm going to open up an object here. I'm going to say test, and then I'm going to pass in a regular expression, which is going to be \.js money. And then I'm going to say loader is Babel. And then I'm going to copy and paste this, add in a comma there, and I'll say loader is ESLint. In this case, I'll do ESLint loader. So what we're doing here is we're saying, if you find a file that matches this regular expression, load it up with Babel. And if you file that matches this regular expression, load it up with ESLint loader. I also want Webpack, I want to prevent Webpack from doing any of these transformations from code included from Node modules. So I'm going to add exclude, and then pass in a regular expression that's simply Node modules. And then for this, I'll also do the same thing. All right, we're not done yet, but we can go ahead and see if this works. So I'm going to come up here. I'm simply going to type in node modules / or \bin \webpack -- config, and then pass in webpack.server. I'm going to hit enter, and we see we have an error. And the reason we have an error is because we didn't configure Babel. So Babel is being loaded and being used, but we didn't tell Babel to use our ES 2015 presets. So it had no knowledge of those transformations that we want. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be .babel.rc. And in here, I'm going to say, I'm going to open up an object, and I'm going to say presets is ES 2015, which corresponds to that Babel presets ES 2015 that I installed earlier. Come back here and rerun Webpack by hitting up and enter. And we see we got it built. No errors. We got a source map, and we got our server.js. If I look at build, we have our server.js, and indeed, both our shared code and our not shared code has been imported. I can come back here and I can type in node build server and hit enter, and it worked, of course, with worked being misspelled. Anyway, we still have more work to do on this, but we will continue on this in the next video, and I'll also recap some of the options that we have here. So see you guys then.